It's tool time. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is
What's the difference between a cynic and a skeptic? Cynical Bambino, you should know this.
I had a boil once that went
I said skeptic, not septic. Internationally respected author, speaker and consultant Jane Hart is somebody who takes an admirably skeptical view of the learning technologies market that never lapses into cynicism. As an independent advisor, she's been helping organisations make good choices for more than 30 years. And as founder of the Centre for Learning and Performance Technologies, she produces the very popular annual Top Tools for Learning list, now in its 12th year. The list is hugely influential. In showing how people are actually using technology to support learning, it provides a radical counterpoint to the view of the world we get from tech vendors. The latest list was published this month, and I wanted to find out from Jane what it's telling us about how we use learning tools as individuals, in the workplace, and in education, and to what extent the mad, disrupted world of upside down we've all been in this last year has changed things. So welcome to The Learning Hack. Really pleased to have you along. Thanks so much for agreeing to do it. This month saw the publication of your highly popular and influential Top 200 Tools for Learning list for 2020. This year's results obviously have been affected by COVID, the pandemic, and closure of physical workplaces and schools and so on. But apart from the obvious boost to Zoom's profile and sales and Microsoft Teams, what do you think your results tell us about how learners, L&D departments and educators have responded to the crisis?
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me to speak with you today. Thinking about that survey, I was watching the results coming in because I manually processed, every one of them to make sure it's a valid result. And what I was noticing was that what seemed to be happening, and I think the final result bore that out, was that L&D and education in many cases had to sort of pretty much overnight put their training offerings online. And you're right, it was things like Zoom, for instance, that really was the way they could do that. So what they seemed to be doing was moving the emphasis away from converting classrooms maybe into e-learning, which they've been doing in the past, towards delivering live training, because it's going to take far too long to create these e-learning courses. So what I'm seeing was, in that respect, e-learning authoring tools and just general content development tools, but actually gone down the list, or the popularity seemed to have decreased. And what seemed to be coming out the list as well was other things like collaboration platforms, general purpose work-based collaboration platforms like Teams and Slack and so forth. And they were, dominant on the list, as you've seen. And interestingly, these platforms were now being used not just for remote working, but for remote training, remote learning, if you like, as well. So that was really quite interesting, though. We're now actually really seeing the use of these enterprise tools rather than specific learning tools for to support remote work and remote learning, training and remote education as well, because that's the same in the education space. Now, when it comes to individuals, what I noticed in particular this year was that they moved away from perhaps accessing content to much more towards the use of communication and collaboration tools. I think that was probably because keeping in touch and interacting with other people became very important for them. And so I noticed a sort of drop in popularity in things like online courses and even on some online resources, although of course YouTube was at the top. So it seemed to me that perhaps for people who are working at home, they had some spare time. They weren't that interested in going and doing something else for themselves. You know, they had other priorities, work, you know, family or whatever it is. And it seemed to me that in some ways, their own personal professional learning had taken a little bit of a back seat, and they were focusing on, you know, what they had to do for their job online and perhaps less on what they could do for themselves. But they were only talking relatively, because if you look at that list, there's still huge numbers of tools on there, but just slight difference this year in those two respects.
Talking a bit more about the differences between the three sub-lists, because you split them into personal learning, workplace learning, and education. What does your research tell us about the differences between those three constituencies, if you like, in how they learn, how they use tools? And but also looking with a wider lens, what significant changes have you noticed over the last few years? You know, if you take the pandemic out of the equation.
Well, the reason why I separated or created extra lists was so you could see the context in which these tools are being used, because up to then it had been just top 100 tools for learning, and people didn't know. And when things like Twitter at the top, people going, oh, but you don't use those in workplace. And so I really did that to sort of show where they are being used. And then last year, what I did was I looked closely at the tools that people are using for their own personal learning, particularly, and I identified 4 particular ways they were using that, which I call the 4 Ds of learning. So they were using them for didactics, for being taught, so online courses and so forth, for discovery, finding things out for themselves, for discourse, so interacting with others, and doing the day job. So those what I call the 4 Ds of learning. So when I looked at the 4 Ds of learning in terms of personal learning, so the tools seem to be largely on tools for discovery and discourse. And as I said earlier, probably a little bit more towards discourse this year, rather than didactics. So in terms of individuals, actually probably going more for finding things out for themselves on the web and so forth, and interacting with their social networks and stuff as a sort of more prevalent way of learning than perhaps through didactics, through being taught through online courses, and highly reliant on consumer web-based tools. But when it comes to workplace learning, of course, the emphasis then shifts very much to the tools they use for didactics, which is probably not unsurprising, you know, a management of learning, the LMSs and so forth. And but although, you know, collaboration tools and web meeting tools have been bigger on the list this year, further up on the list this year, but again, the emphasis is perhaps more on the delivery of content, management of content. Although, as I've said, I'm beginning to see the integration of, you know, platforms for learning and working. And in that respect, it's the Microsoft family of tools that really seem to be dominant in the workplace. Whereas, of course, when it comes to education, of course, didactics is their main business, but they do seem to use a wider variety of tools, of which Google, the Google family is the dominant one. And of course, this year, Google Classroom, part of the Google suite, has shot up right up to 15th place, followed by Google Meet, for instance. So I'm seeing sort of consumer tools, obviously in personal, Microsoft Office in the workplace, and Google Family in the in education.
It's really interesting because Josh Bersin has written about how Microsoft is coming to dominate the world of workplace learning. And what you're saying there, that Microsoft may have the enterprise, but Google has the classroom, has education.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be from my research that's the case, And I think because they have so many tools, it's not just like one product. You know, they have a whole ecosystem of tools that allow them to interact with one another. That's really the beauty of it, I think, because they don't have to, you know, you don't have to have an LMS here or something that you can actually use all those tools, and they integrate so well now with one another that, you know, you can really reuse things and share things much more easily. So I think the families of tools are going to be prevalent in the future.
When we had George Siemens on the podcast, he said he thought that learning is an inadequate word for what we do today. And a lot of what we're doing with our learning tools is actually something more like sense making and wayfinding, I think was the term he used. And again, people like Nick Shackleton-Jones say a lot of what we think is learning is actually performance support. Most researchers, I suspect, I've certainly had this, I know you have, find at some point a topic area is collapsing, or at least it's got fuzzy borders. How do you feel about the fuzziness of the word learning? Because you take a very wide definition of learning, I think, in compiling your list. You've got kind of LinkedIn in there, which some people would say is an entirely different activity.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you feel about that fuzziness generally? And do you think it's getting more marked or worse?
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the word learning itself is very confusing. I'm very confused. I think for many people, they still equate it with training or education, or at least learning from being taught, and they don't see that learning as a much wider thing that can happen in many different ways. And I think because we use the word learning to mean training, people get confused, and it sort of reinforces that whole concept that learning equals training. I try to advise people not to use the word learning unless they have to, because unless they're very clear about what it means, they really should use some other word to describe it. So whether it's finding things out or acquiring knowledge in a very specific way, whatever it is, but try to be very clear about what you mean by the word learning. And I also think, certainly in the workplace, it's going to be important to everyone to recognize that learning does happen in other places than just being taught or trained. And they're just as valuable ways of learning, and it's not only the learning that you get from classroom or courses or somebody telling you something that is the most important way. And I think the trouble is, until we can kind of, reconcile those issues, that, it is going to be confusing. When I talk about learning, I mean it in its broadest sense, when others, they're talking about very specific training. But, I've talked about this many, many times, and people say, oh, you're being pedantic about the word, and that's not important. But I actually think it is, because I think euphemisms don't actually help.
Yeah.
So I've got no really answers about how to address it, unless I say people try and use different words. And whether it's getting worse, I don't know, but it's certainly confusing.
I suppose a simple way to make the definition, perhaps a simplistic way, is that learning in some way involves memory. That you're trying to get things embedded into long-term memory that will change behaviours and attitudes over time, won't it?
I would dispute that, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's think about just-in-time learning or performance support. You actually, all you need to do is find something out to do the job. You don't actually need to remember it. All you need to remember is where you can find that thing again if you need help in doing that task. So we're getting into very different approaches to how people think about it. Let's say some people say learning's hard, it's difficult. Well, actually, yes, if you're studying, it could be, but you learn a lot accidentally or serendipitously, and things you don't even realize you've learned. I always take the example. When I was younger, I learning to speak a language, and when I go abroad, I obviously pick it up, I just hear things, and I find myself speaking or saying something, and I think, well, where did I learn that? I mean, I wasn't taught that in the classroom. So we learn a lot without realizing it, and I think this is the important things that I've been trying to stress, is that we learn a lot from a daily work, just doing our job, but we don't actually realize we're learning that stuff. As I say, if you think only learning comes from training, then you're not going to recognize the learning from doing your job. But we do. And what we need to do is actually think about that experience we've had during the day and what we've learned from it. And so start to sort of reflect on it, then we can start to bring it up and then sort of recognize it as learning or having learned something, and then maybe share anything, really good with other people.
Yeah.
So I think, again, but it's, as I say, learning is such a huge topic that, that is just one aspect of it, of course. But I think all we need to do is be aware that we do learn in many different ways. And, sometimes it requires memory, sometimes it doesn't.
So I've been following your list for quite some time, quite a number of years. And during many of those years, I was working for vendor companies that sold learning technologies and content. And this is one list we realized you couldn't buy your way onto. It's difficult to game, unlike most of the others. And it also had this rather embarrassing feature that you had to look quite a way down the list. And this is true of this year's list as it is with any others. Before you get to any of the names, any vendor names of specialist learning technologies providers that you might see on the floor of learning technologies exhibition, for instance, so like your kind of Saber's cornerstones, they're well down there. Moodle comes up quite early on because it's used a lot in education and so on. It's almost a generic. But what do you think that tells us about the LearnTech market if so many of the tools that people actually use for learning are generic? Is that a failing, or is it just what?
It's a good question, and you're right. You can't buy your way onto the list, and some people try to game it, I have to say, but yeah. I actually do try and keep a view on what's going on. But you're right. But I think the fact is that that it goes back to the whole point about what this learning word means. What does learning technologies mean? I actually think learning technologies, as we come to understand it, is pretty much about training technologies or educational technologies.
Didactics.
It's not got that,
it's
didactics. It's not about the wider ways of learning, which are, as I said, people using the web and so forth, or interacting on work-based platforms to learn from another, or whatever it is. And so those tools don't actually appear at learning technologies at exhibitions, and I don't think actually even the Microsoft or whoever it would even dream of going there, because they themselves don't see their tools as learning technologies. And certainly, in the past, I've tried to persuade conference or exhibition organisers to sort of like bring in an online view of how you could use tools online, consumer tools online for learning. But I mean, of course, that's not really what the game they're in. So that's not happened. But but I think if we renamed it back to training technologies or educational technologies, that would help to place it into this big jigsaw of learning. But I don't think that's going to happen, because learning is a much more appealing term than training or education, isn't it?
Yeah, it's more kind of touchy-feely. I suppose people like Microsoft and products like Microsoft Teams would feature at certain trade shows, but they'd be for the IT community, I imagine, or for people who purchase sort of ERP systems at high-level enterprise software, but they don't necessarily come to, this has been a thing in the past that large companies have tended to ignore the learning market because it's been quite small. Mary Meeker a few years back, maybe 5-6 years back, pointed out that you probably reached kind of peak digital transformation in certain bits of enterprise, but there was loads and loads of headroom in education and training. And I think you have begun to see more presence from people like Microsoft and Google, just for the sort of things that we're talking about there, Google Classroom, Microsoft owning the workplace learning thing. So maybe it's a long, slow process, rather than what we all suspected would happen, is that suddenly some big, tech titan would come in and just commoditize the whole area and sweep away all those specialist providers.
I would say very disrupted when I walk around conference exhibitions, and all I'm seeing is PowerPoint-based tools and learning management systems, and I think, come on, you need to move on a little bit here, you know. And then really it's all about tools that sort of automate, you know, AI tools that sort of automate all that stuff. So it's not, we haven't really sort of broadened it out, but, you know, I think I'm on a long-term battle with that one, I think.
Experience.
It's everything that ever happened to you, everything that ever will. Experiences, both huge and not so huge, slowly add up over a lifetime to become your experience. Everything you know, everything you are.
Experience.
And now the experience word is taking over learning.
Learning experience.
Our learning experience.
Learning experience design.
Learning experiences.
And some worry that the change will distract from what science has told us about how people learn. Do we even know what we mean by the words learning experience? Is this a learning experience? Or this? Or this? I've talked to some incredibly smart designers, theoreticians, L&D practitioners and technologists on behalf of the good people at Learning Pool. And together we've created a series of guides and resources to help you get the best from this change. Download the first of these now, the Experience White Paper.
Experience.
Do you think there's some things that you can't really turn into a learning technologies product because you just inherently can't, because it's so embedded in everyday life? So you'd naturally use a generic platform,
Yeah.
like, Slack or Teams.
Yeah, I just think we need to recognize that those are places where you can learn as much as the tools, you know, the ones that are designated as learning technologies. You know, it's not only those technologies where you can learn. You can learn anywhere, at any time, with anything, in any context. You know, and I think, and that, of course, that makes it a bit crazy difficult to manage. But you know, we think we need to have this wider view, and I think a lot of people do recognize that. You know, I'm not out in the wilderness talking to myself about this. I think people do recognize it. It's just that, you know, go to conferences, it's back to this very defined view of learning. Yeah, and perhaps it's the way that the vendor market skews it, because the tools that they can manage to turn into learntech tools, the sum of those things becomes a taxonomy of learning, and it's a false one. So I think that your lists are a corrective, and they're a constant reminder that no, this is really the picture of what learning is, and even if you do it through a tool-based thing, if you don't just look at the specialist. Still, I'm waffling on. Next question. You're an advocate of self-directed learning, and an increasing number of the tools and platforms we see from learntech vendors at least nod in that direction, LXPs, for instance. But it seems to me that bringing the idea of learner autonomy into the design of an enterprise platform very quickly highlights a tension between what the individual wants to do and what the organization needs the individual to want to do. So there's kind of tension between the two different goals and culture, if you like. But all learners need some kind of direction, don't they? Because, you know, we don't know what we don't know. What do you think is the best way to strike that balance and deal with that tension? Well, I think there are a number of ways to operationalize this, and I think they depend very much on the type of organization, whether it's one that's, you know, very strongly traditional, you know, top-down organization that finds it very difficult to offer any autonomy to their people, even, you know, through any flexibility in working or not, you know, and on the other hand, you've got sort of smaller organizations that, you know, need a much more agile way to support the learning development of their people. So what I'm seeing is a number of different ways, say, to operationalize this. There's one, the sort of things like provide a sort of structure framework, you know, of pathways of things to achieve goals, in career patterns and so forth. But you can select from those and you can do things you want to. So there's a sort of certain amount of autonomy in it, but it's not quite, but it means pretty much controlled by the organization. And then we've got the sort of another one in the middle, which is where people are encouraged to design their professional goals aligned with the business goals, and then identify the best ways to achieve them. But all that sort of semi-formal way, I guess, because the organization is still going to perhaps provide time for that to happen, and if they want that time, if they're going to give time for that to happen, then they want to see that it's recorded and that things are achieved and so forth. So that's sort of a middle road. And then there's the one at the end, which is actually will empower you to learn things for be fully self-learning or fully DIY learning, whatever you want to call it. And, in some organizations, that's what's happening. Some of the smaller, lean organizations, they recognize that people are aware of their own, that they're knowledgeable and autonomous enough to be able to decide what they need to do their job properly and prepare for the future. But so we've got a wide range of options here. So it depends, I'd say, on the organization and also the level of autonomy of individuals. Knowledge workers probably are more sort of autonomous individuals anyway, and most of them are doing it for themselves on the side, if not part of the organizational sort of process. And of course, other people really wouldn't know where to start. They wouldn't even know, what they have to do, when they have to do it. So I think, all these considerations have to be taken into the deciding which way you're going to do it, and that is very important. You can't just say, off you go and do it all yourself. That's clearly not going to work in all organizations, but it might work in some. So there is no one size fits all as in anything nowadays. But what it does strike me that's becoming important as organizations realize they can't do everything for everybody. They can't possibly create everything or do everything people are going to need to do their jobs now or in the future. They've got to support people to do much more for themselves. And when that comes, I know I've already mentioned this word support, it's not actually about design and delivery anymore. It becomes supporting people to do things for themselves, helping them identify their professional goals, helping them find the best resources to achieve those goals, and then helping them to sort of evidence their new performance and so forth. So that's the big change, I think, where organizations are moving it more towards a self-directed environment. If it's right for them, they're moving the people, the L&D roles, if you like, are moving from like design and delivery of training and so forth to support. And I think that's when organizations are thinking about that, they need to take that into consideration, that the role, the L&D role needs to change as well. So it's not about just sort of like opening it up, but considering when we could do this. And, some organizations are sort of taking a slow path down to it. Others are sort of jumping into sort of like, well, we support self-learning. And, and I know a number of smaller organizations that just realize this is the best way to go because people are best, their people best know what they need to do.
Obviously, what you need from what you say is flexibility. You need to be able to respond to the organizational culture, whether it's more directive or less directive. You need to be able to respond to the stage of learning that people, leadership learning might need to be quite open-ended and self-directed, whereas induction, you need a bit more hand-holding and structure. So you need an immense amount of flexibility. Flexibility, when it comes to technology tools, almost inevitably involves more complexity. So the people that have to buy and specify the system and integrate it with all the other company systems have a degree of complexity to deal with there. I think that's something that's never occurred to me, really.
Well, and again, the way I would sort of say it's not necessarily the case. In fact, what I've been finding is that because in order to deal with some of these issues, people are actually going back to basic tools and things.
Yeah.
They're not trying to find complex systems. So you don't need, adaptive learning systems. You don't need AI-based systems. You can do a lot with some very simple tools, even just basic office tools and the collaboration tools. But you just need to understand how you can use these in the best ways. And I am going to be creating a new resource about, how we can use some of the very basic tools with sort of just use fundamental guidance to support all these ways of learning. You don't need to have big platforms to control it all. And in fact, if we're getting people to do more and more for themselves, there are tools that they can use, like, digital notebooks and so forth, that can be used to sort of organize and manage their own learning and development and achievement of goals and so forth. So I think we don't have to think complexity. I think learning technologies platform vendors probably want to get you in that room, but actually I think you can get an awful lot by going back to basics and looking at fundamentals and so forth. So anyway,
I suppose it comes back to that question of whether you go for an ecosystem or a kind of Death Star, all-encompassing talent suite, whatever, and I think I can tell whereabouts you lie on that spectrum. So away from your list, you also consult with businesses about their L&D. And I'm interested to know what the single biggest problem you see L&D confronting today, if there's one that does particularly stand out, or if it's complex problems, and what sort of answers are they finding to that problem?
Well, I think that one of the biggest problems they're finding is that they are being bombarded with a mass of methodologies and approaches and tools and platforms, and they really don't have the time to research and understand them, as long as trying to do their day job as well. And often people, from what I hear, persuaded, by a good salesman to sort of like purchase the next best thing in learning technologies or whatever it is. So when I'm working with people, I'm trying to help them find this way through the maze, really. And again, as I said earlier, it's not a one size fits all. We've got to understand your organization, the people within your organization, what's going to work best within your environment. And, and they know better than I do. All I do is try to sort of guide them in the right way. I don't say, right, that's that tool for you and that tool for you. I try to help them come to those decisions themselves. And that's always what I've done in consulting, which is, work with people, not to try and take it over and do, run a whole project for them or, whatever, manage everything for them. It's to give them the support to make those decisions themselves and do a lot of the, groundwork perhaps for them about, well, these are the things you might want to consider, and then sort of bring it down to a sort of manageable amount of things they can look at. So, but it seems to me that, the mass, so many people are saying this, that, and the other, and they really don't know what is right and what's happening. And the people that seem to be most successful in it are the ones that do it, have a gut feeling for it. I think it works best for my organization. They achieve a lot, but the ones that are you're trying to sort of find things, they just not going with their gut. And I understand it's scary business, what you do, but I think the ones that seem to achieve the most are the ones that sort of think, I have a vision, I know where I want to go, and they achieve a lot through that.
Yeah, and keeping it simple seems to be a pretty important thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas I suppose vendors and gurus like to make it more complex because I'm veering into the the kind of area of cynicism, which is terrible. Lastly, what are you working on at the moment, and what are you getting most excited about in learning for the future? I mean, obviously, when we talk about the future and the present, we can't really escape the fact that there is this kind of worldwide pandemic that's throwing everything up. But that can provoke optimism. With George Siemens, who was saying this is an unrepeatable, brilliant moment for digital learning effectively because everything's gone online. So what's exciting you at the moment in learning?
Well, as I think I've implied, for me, exciting, it's not about one, specific learning platform or technology. It's about building that ecosystem of interesting and useful little tools that all fit together and work together. They're not some separate bits. They all kind of interrelate and you can share stuff. So for me, in terms of technologies, that'd be the future, the ecosystem approach, but, very much one that's sort of like, doesn't require a lot of technical expertise to put the bits together. So for instance, if you think about Slack, it integrates with so many tools. You can do so much. You've got the main platform, but you can bring in Google Docs, and you can bring Twitter feeds in, and curation platforms, and so much. So you've got the sort of core there, and you can just bring in the other things you need. But, in terms of getting excited, I suppose the thing that excites us is that more people are realizing that, their future lies in their own hands. And, it's not about just waiting to be spoon-fed stuff. They need to recognize that the world is such a volatile place, that they've got to do more for themselves. And, I hear more and more people recognizing that. Also, the fact that in lockdown, they've had a lot of flexibility to lead their lives the way they wanted to work, to do the work patterns the way, and they want to retain that flexibility, and they want to be able to have voice and autonomy to do things much more in their own way. So, what I'm doing with the people I'm working with is actually trying to bring those two things into support them. And I know a lot of people have already got huge systems in place, and it's just using those systems, making the most of those systems rather than getting in more systems. And it's about adopting more learner-centric learning models, as we spoke about earlier, to help people, help the L&D who are beginning to sort of like get squeezed into sort of like one or two people in some organizations, help them do more in their own time. But, all those things mean changing mindsets, cultures, which are well embedded in organizations. So it takes as much time to do that. Well, that's an ongoing process rather than just, bringing in a tool and adopting it or whatever. It's actually changing things. But as we said, COVID, CEOs and other people have tried to change things overnight. COVID comes along, everything gets thrown up in the air. So I think George is right. We're in a place where people are willing to make changes, or having had change thrust upon them, they're now open to making more changes. So that's the exciting thing. I think we've opened up things. Maybe with things we're getting a little bit sort of static. We've become more dynamic now. But I just hope we can change in those directions I've mentioned, more sort of self-directed, learner-centric learning, more tools that sort of support one another and can be reused and so forth. And move away from this sort of like all-encompassing learning platform has to be the hub of it all, because I think, yes, it does have a place, certainly for formal compliance training and so some other things, but it's not going to manage and control workplace learning. That's just not possible.
Yeah, I noticed that you've impressively managed to avoid using the phrase learning in the flow of work. Is that just because it's got a bit of a cliche and after a while your mouth gets tired of saying some of those phrases? Or do you have a problem with that, do you think?
Well, yes and no. I think from what I've seen, a lot of learning the flow of work is actually training people at the desktop. It's not really, how I would like to see it, was getting stuff out of the workflow. You're learning from the workflow, achieving. So learning in the flow of work is like, right, instead of going on a class, we're just going to put it onto your desktop, and while you're doing it, and or accessing it whilst you are doing a job or whatever. Okay, that's fine, but that's really just changing where we put the training now. It's not actually opening up to like, well, actually, interacting with your colleagues and taking time to reflect on whatever. That's what, for me, workflow learning is all about, understanding how we learn from what we do. But so it's a difficult one. Again, it's it's that learning word, isn't it? We just it just makes us think in a particular direction.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was wonderful.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and very interesting questions you had there. So think it's very easy for me just to sort of do my stuff and not actually take time to think about what it actually means. So thank you for the questions.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Jane and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube, and don't forget to leave a review and a 5-star rating if you want to help other people find us. You can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or on my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. Next time, we're delving into the art of decision making with leadership learning expert Matthew Confer. Till then, stay classy, learning people.
Now I finally get it.
Hold on, I'll have to fiddle about with the
The knobs.
yeah, marvelous stuff, technology, isn't it?